Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology in India. Today we are going to discuss the module Understanding Modernity in India. This module has been written by Professor Chandan Kumar Sharma, Department of Sociology, Tezpur University. It is important as students to understand that within this whole paper, Sociology in India, there are three modules relating to understanding modernity. The first is Understanding Modernity in India, 2. Modernization of Indian Tradition, and 3. Contested Modernity. In all these modules, what we are trying to show is that based upon the works of Indian scholars and international scholars in trying to understand modernity, we have tried to understand how difficult it is to conceptualize modernity within the Indian structure. We would discuss the whole debate of tradition and modernity. We will also discuss not only the whole ideas of contested modernity, but specifically in this module, we are going to discuss the concept of understanding modernity, especially in the manner in which it has been conceptualized using the concepts of Sanskritization, Brahminization, dominant caste, Westernization and modernization. Objective: to understand the issues and processes of social change in India. 2. To understand the concepts of Sanskritization, Brahminization, dominant caste, Westernization and modernization. Introduction: India is a country with considerable geographical, social and cultural diversity. This makes it indeed a challenging task to explain and theorize the multidimensional diverse social realities in India. It is even more challenging to grapple with the issues and processes of social change in the country. Nevertheless, different concepts and approaches have been put forth to study the social realities and processes of social change in India. Sanskritization and Westernization are two such concepts propounded by M. Srinivas, referred to as the doyen of Indian sociologists, to explain some features of religious, cultural and social change in India. Both these terms, apparently opposite to each other, have generated much debate and discussions highlighting the strengths, weaknesses and above all interrelationship. This essay provides a general outline of these concepts, their interrelations and limitations. Sanskritization. The term Sanskritization was first used in Srinivas's work Religion and Society among the Coors of South India, published in 1952. Sanskritization is used to explain the process of upward mobility within the Hindu caste system. According to Srinivas, the caste system is far from a rigid system in which the position of each component of caste is fixed for all time. The movement has always been possible, and especially so in the middle regions of hierarchy. A low caste was able in a generation or two to rise to a higher position in the hierarchy by adopting vegetarianism and teetotalism and by Sanskritizing its ritual and pantheon. In short, it took over as far as possible the customs, rites and beliefs of the Brahmins, and the adoption of the Brahminic way of life by a low caste seems to have been frequent, now theoretically forbidden. This process has been called Sanskritization in preference to Brahminization, as certain Vedic rites are confined to the Brahmins and the two other twice-born castes. Sanskritization versus Brahminization. It is to be noted that Srinivas first used the term Brahminization instead of Sanskritization to explain the process of social adoption of the way of life of upper caste by the lower caste. He identified Sanskritization with imitation of the Brahminical customs and manners by the lower caste. Srinivas presumed that the Brahmins were the sole model of emulation for the Sanskritizing groups. However, subsequently he abandoned the term for Sanskritization on account of a number of reasons and defined it as a process by which a low Hindu caste, tribal or other group changes its customs, ritual, ideology and way of life in the direction of a high, frequently twice-born caste. Generally, such changes are followed by a claim to a higher position in the caste hierarchy than that traditionally conceded to the claimant caste by the local community. There are several reasons which persuaded Srinivas to redefine the above process of caste mobility. Firstly, he found that Brahminization is subsumed under the wider process of Sanskritization. However, he also points out that the two may be at variance with each other at times. For example, though Sanskritization necessitates renunciation of certain habits and customs on part of the Sanskritizing groups, such as drinking liquor, eating beef and pork, and so on, the Brahmins in the Vedic period drank soma and alcoholic drink, ate beef and offered blood sacrifices which were given up in the post-Vedic times. Though the Brahmins today by and large are vegetarians, there are non-vegetarian Brahmins as well. The Assamese, Bengali, Kashmiri, Maithili, Oriya and Saraswat Brahmins eat non-vegetarian food. The Brahmins are characterized by many other regional variations, suggesting that they cannot be treated as a homogeneous group throughout India with respect to their habits and customs. Therefore, if the term Brahminization was used, it would have been necessary to specify which particular Brahmin group was used as a reference group. Besides, as the Brahmins are also undergoing various changes over a period of time in the cultural domain, it would have been further necessary to specify at which particular period of history a particular Brahmin group is referred to as a model for Sanskritization. Secondly, the agents of Sanskritization are not always the Brahmins. In fact, there was a prohibition on the non-twice born caste from following the customs and rites of the Brahmins, and it is not unreasonable to suppose that the Brahmins were responsible for this. On the other hand, there were non-Brahmin agents of Sanskritization as well. The Lingayats of South India, for example, have been a powerful force for Sanskritization of several lower castes of Karnataka. Though founded by a Brahmin named Basava in the 12th century, the Lingayat movement was anti-Brahminical in tone and spirit, drawing a large number of followers from lower caste. In fact, the Lingayats of Mysore claim equality with Brahmins, and the more orthodox of them do not accept food cooked or handled by the Brahmins, argues Srinivas. Srinivas further cites the example of Smiths of South India to illustrate his point from another angle. The Smiths, who call themselves Vishwakarma Brahmins, wear sacred thread and have their rituals Sanskritized. Although some of them still continue to eat non-vegetarian food and drink alcohol, the entire community is treated as one belonging to left-hand division of caste, and no caste belonging to the right-hand division, including the Holayas, untouchables, will eat or drink water touched by them. Until recently, they suffered from a number of disabilities which were allowed to celebrate their weddings only in villages in which there was a temple to the caste deity Kali. Normally, Sanskritization enables a caste to obtain a higher position in hierarchy, but in the case of the Smiths, it seems to have resulted only in drawing upon themselves the wrath of all other castes, argues Srinivas. There are many such examples. What is clear from the above is that Sanskritization is a process of social mobility, cannot be explained only with the help of the Brahminical model. There could be other models such as Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra as well, depending on the context. In fact, Srinivas also highlights the fact that Brahmin claim supremacy was contested by Kshatriyas on various occasions. Citing G.S. Ghure, he explains how early Jain and Buddhist literature asserted the preeminent position of Kshatriyas in the caste hierarchy. Srinivas also draws upon the work of anthropologists to justify his contention. Pocock pointed out the existence of a Kshatriya model of Sanskritization in addition to a Brahminical model. Milton Singer states there exist not one or two models of Sanskritization but three, if not four. Srinivas quotes Singer. The local version of Sanskritic Hinduism may use the four Varna labels, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, but the defining content of these labels varies with locality and the needs to be empirically determined for any particular locality. It has also been discovered that the relative prestige and rank of these different Varnas tend to vary with locality, time and group. In many areas, example the kingly or the martial, the lifestyle has a rank equal to or sometimes higher than that of the Brahmin. The groups in these areas who wish to improve their status do so by adopting some of the stigmata of Rajput lifestyle, that is, by Rajputizing the way of life. Even the lifestyles of the merchant and peasants have been taken as models in localities where these groups are dominant. Yoginder Singh theorizes this situation when he states that there are two levels of meanings which are implicit in the concept of Sanskritization. These two levels may be described as historical specific and contextual specific connotations of Sanskritization. He writes, in historical specific sense, Sanskritization refers to those processes in Indian history which led to changes in the status of various castes, its leadership or its cultural patterns in different periods of history. It is indicative of an endogenous nature of social change in the broad historical spectrum of India. In the contextual specific sense, however, Sanskritization denotes contemporaneous processes of cultural imitation by upper caste, by lower caste or subcaste in different parts of India. The nature of Sanskritization of this type is by no means uniform, as the content of cultural norms or customs being imitated may vary from Sanskritic or Hindu traditional forms to the tribal and even Islamic patterns. The contextual process of Sanskritization is illustrated by various studies undertaken in different contexts throughout India. These studies show that in many places the lower caste imitate the customs of other non-Brahmin castes as mentioned above. In exceptional cases, even the higher caste have been found imitating the tribal ways, which may be described as a process of tribalization. In some other contexts, even Muslim cultural model is found to be emulated by both the upper as well as the lower caste. Locally dominant caste. Closely associated with Srinivas' concept of Sanskritization is the concept of locally dominant caste. It is a locally dominant caste which, by dint of its landed property, numerical strength and high position in the local hierarchy, wields significant influence in a particular area. Such a locally dominant caste, sometimes there may be more than one such caste in a locality, becomes a reference group for the marginal groups in the region. Srinivas mentions that occasionally we find castes which enjoyed political and economic power but were not rated high in ritual ranking. However, even in such cases, Sanskritization occurred sooner or later, as without it, claim to a higher position is not effective. Third, the three axes of power in the caste system are the ritual, economic and the political ones, and the position of power in any one sphere usually leads to the acquisition of power in the other two. This does not mean, however, that inconsistencies do not occur. When a wealthy caste is seen in low ritual position and contrarily, a caste with high ritual position is poor. However, it is not that there has been no obstacles in the way of lower caste emulating the lifestyles of the higher caste. Locally dominant caste or the king of a region was often hostile to the process of the lower caste taking over the customs and rites of the higher caste. Yet, Brahminical customs and ways of life managed to spread not only among all Hindus but also among some outlying tribes, argues Srinivas. Srinivas says that this happened because in hierarchically stratified Hindu society, each group tries to pass for a higher group, and the best way of staking a claim to the higher position is to adopt the customs and ways of life of higher caste. Srinivas makes it clear that Sanskritization does not automatically result in the achievement of a higher status for the group. The latter must lay claim to belong to a particular varna. Besides, the concerned group must also alter their customs, diet and the way of life suitably, and if there are any inconsistencies in the claim, they must explain these inconsistencies by inventing an appropriate myth. Further, the group must be content to wait an indefinite period. During this period, it must maintain a continuous pressure regarding its claims. Therefore, before a claim is accepted by other castes, usually a generation or two must pass. It is also important to note that despite the prevalence of different models of Sanskritization, depending upon which caste is the locally dominant one, Srinivas holds that if the locally dominating caste is the Brahmins, the Sanskritization process will probably be quicker and Brahminical values will spread. Whereas if the dominating caste is local Kshatriya or Vaishya caste, Sanskritization will be slower and the values will not be Brahminical. He even speaks of the possibility of de-Sanskritization of the imitating caste if the local dominant group is non-Sanskritic or less Sanskritic ones. Westernization. Westernization refers to the changes brought about as a consequence of the contact with Western culture, particularly the British. Srinivas first used the concept in an essay called A Note on Sanskritization and Westernization in the journal Far Eastern Quarterly in 1956, which was subsequently included in his book Caste in Modern India 1962. Though there had been other Western groups such as Portuguese, the Dutch and the French to India who had influenced Indian society and culture, none of them had the scale of influence as the British, precisely because of the fact that the latter had ruled almost all over India for a period of 200 years. Their rule produced radical and lasting changes in the Indian society and culture, and they had brought with them new technology, institutions, knowledge, beliefs, values which often went against the traditional Indian institutions, values and practices. For example, the British judicial system was based on the principles of equality, went directly against the traditional system of law based on status and hierarchy. According to Srinivas, Westernization in India occurred at three levels: primary, secondary and tertiary. At the primary level, the link between the Western stimulus and the Indian response was simple and direct, which included those who participated in the Westernization process in a more immediate sense, that is, those who attended new educational institutions, entered the professions, took up jobs in bureaucracy and engaged themselves in trade, commerce and industry in the big developing towns, while a much larger underwent Westernization in secondary sense. For example, patients in the hospital, litigants in law courts, readers of newspapers, books in the Indian languages. The tertiary level includes Indians belonging to the rural folk, lower caste whose exposure to Westernization was remote and limited. Modernization versus Westernization. Srinivas points out that modernization is a popular term to explain the process of change brought about in a non-Western country by contact, direct or indirect, with a Western country. In a celebrated book, The Passing of Traditional Society, Modernizing the Middle East, 1958, the US social scientist Daniel Lerner, for example, has preferred modernization to Westernization. He argues that modernization includes a disquieting, positivist spirit touching public institutions as well as private aspirations, a revolution in communications, wider economic and political participation and social mobility. Furthermore, modernization enables people to view the social future as manipulable rather than ordained, and their personal prospects in terms of achievement rather than heritage. Srinivas also goes on to discuss as to why the term Westernization is unacceptable to scholars scholars like Lerner, who finds that it is too local a label, or the model which is imitated may not be a Western country, for example Russia, Turkey, Japan or India. Another important reason for Lerner's preference of modernization to westernization is that educated people in Middle East, while wanting the modern package, reject the label made in USA or for that matter made in USSR. Srinivas, however, argues that it is difficult for a sociologist to be certain that a particular change in part of the process of modernization. He cites US sociologist Robert Bellah, who contends that modernization involves the rationalization of ends, which means that the goal chosen by a society should be rational and the subject of public discussion. However, social goals are in the final analysis the expression of value preferences and therefore non-rational. The public discussion of goals is no guarantee to their rationality. Moreover, Srinivas does not find the value of humanitarianism ingrained into the concept of modernization. According to Srinivas, unlike modernization, however, the term westernization is ethically neutral. As he writes, its use does not carry the implication that it is good or bad, whereas modernization is normally used in the sense that it is good. But he still points out to other difficulties in westernization. For example, not all elements known to be part of Western culture originated in the West. Many such elements were derived from China, India or West Asia. Besides, the concept of West is also not entirely homogeneous. However, having acknowledged these problems, Srinivas preferred the term westernization, which he described as an inclusive, complex and many-layered concept, taking cognizance of the intricate ways in which it operates. However, at the time he was conscious of the varied ways, often with opposite results, in which westernization operates. As he states, the form and pace of westernization varied from one region to another and from one section of population to another. For instance, if a group of people become westernized in their dress, diet, manners, speech, sports and in the gadgets they use, while another absorbed Western science, knowledge and literature, remaining relatively free from westernization in the externals. Considering all these, Srinivas emphasized on qualifying the term westernization by prefixes primary, secondary and tertiary as mentioned above. Westernization and Sanskritization share a very interesting relationship. Apparently, these two processes of social change appear to be diametrically opposite to each other. However, a closer look gives a different picture of this relationship. As Srinivas said, the spread of Sanskrit theological ideas increased under British rule. The development of communications carried Sanskritization to areas previously inaccessible, and the spread of literacy carried it to the groups very low in caste hierarchy. Western technology, railways, the internal combustion engine, press, radio and plane has aided the spread of Sanskritization. He cites the example of the tradition of Harikatha, a traditional religious discourse of Karnataka, where a priest reads and explains a religious story to his audience. Each story takes a few weeks to complete. The audience meeting for a few hours every evening. Harikathas may be held at any time, but important Hindu festivals are considered equally suitable for the purpose. The reach of Harikathas has spread much wider with the introduction of microphone for the narrator. Similarly, Indian films have also played a very important role in the popularization of the stories from the epics and the Puranas. Many films have been made on the lives of the saints such as Tukaram, Chaitanya, Meera and others. Cheap and popular editions of these epics, Puranas, also widely available thanks to the advent of print industry. In the more modern context, the television in India has played an extraordinary role in the spread of Sanskritic stories by broadcasting Hindu mythological soaps which have reached the nook and corner of the country. Srinivas further emphasizes that the introduction of the Western political institution like the parliamentary democracy has also contributed to the increased Sanskritization of the country. Prohibition of Sanskritic value has been written into the Constitution of India. Besides, it is seen that caste which took the lead in undergoing westernization was mostly from the upper class, especially the Brahmins of the traditional hierarchy. Even a cursory observation at the composition of the Indian officers, social reformers, educationers, lawyers, army, traders right from the early colonial period testify to the fact as to how the upper caste, that is the more Sanskritized caste, were front runners in seizing the opportunities offered by the colonial administration. It is also true, however, that in certain cases it appeared that Brahmins were handicapped by some customs in the race for westernization. For example, the Brahminic customs such as vegetarianism and abstinence from alcoholism were in sharp contradiction with the English habits of eating beef and pork, drinking whiskey and so on. As Srinivas writes, while the westernization of Brahmins enabled the entire Hindu society to westernize, the Brahmins themselves found some aspects of westernization such as the British diet, dress and freedom from pollution difficult to accept. Nevertheless, the Brahmins were the most westernized caste group in India is beyond doubt and thus have been able to perpetuate their traditional hegemony. However, Srinivas is also conscious of the conflict between Sanskritic and Western values. For example, he writes, there appears to be a conflict between the worldview disclosed by systematic application of scientific method to the various spheres of knowledge and the worldview of the traditional religion. During the British rule, for example, a section of the westernized Indian elites who hailed mainly from the upper caste acquired customs and habits such as drinking alcoholic liquor from the British despite the sharp contradiction of these habits with Sanskritic customs. Besides, Sanskritization of the Brahmins brought them away from many of their erstwhile Sanskritic habits. For example, where formerly eating used to be a ritual act, where the Brahmins would wear ritually pure clothes and the eating floor purified with cow dung solution, such practices are no more in existence today. Not only that, many Western educated Brahmins today have even discarded the sacred thread. Thus, he contends the assumption of a simple and direct opposition between the two, Sanskritization and Westernization, and of the ultimate triumph of Westernization, I find too simple an hypothesis, considering the great complexity of the process involved. Srinivas argues, while in some cases they were in conflict with each other, in many other ways they complemented each other. However, on the question as to whether Sanskritization of a lower caste or a tribe is an essential condition prior to its Westernization, Srinivas says that though he finds empirical evidence of this being true, is quick to add that his evidence to such a contention is limited to some non-Brahmin caste of Mysore and does not refer to any logical necessity for Sanskritization occurring prior to Westernization. In fact, he admits that it is possible that Westernization may occur without intermediate process of Sanskritization. However, in this context, it is relevant to refer to Harold Gould's observation in the Sherupur village of Uttar Pradesh. Gould shows that as lower caste began their Sanskritization backed by democratization of the Indian society after independence, and as the Brahmins and the Rajputs began losing their ground in the old caste hierarchy, the latter reached out in the direction of Westernization in order to attain new sources of status and power, which effectively continue to give them the feeling that they are maintaining suitable social distance with whom they are traditionally defined as low. Indeed, rapid industrialization in the post-independence era had made this possible. Social movements among the backward castes have been anti-Brahmin in their overtones right from the very beginning. After independence, the constitutional provisions, along with various affirmative actions initiated by the government and various spheres, socio-economic and political, have also created conditions and opportunities for the lower caste and tribes to bypass the process of Sanskritization as a means to achieve vertical social mobility. Conclusion. In the above, we have discussed the two very influential concepts of Sanskritization and Westernization to explain the process of social change in India. While Sanskritization refers to the process by which a low Hindu caste or a tribal or other group changes its customs, ritual, ideology and the way of life in the direction of a high and frequently twice born caste, Westernization refers to the changes brought about in the Indian society as a consequence of the contact with Western culture, particularly the British. Apparently, the two processes are contrary to each other. However, careful observation shows that they are closely related. While the most Sanskritized castes, beginning with the Brahmins, were the first to westernize and lead the process of Westernization in India, Westernization on its path also helped to spread Sanskritic values, customs and texts. However, the changes that these two concepts address are confined to the domain of culture to the exclusion of other much more significant political and economic processes. Thus, they offer only a partial explanation to the social changes in the Indian society. However, despite their obvious limitations, as Yoginder Singh contends, as truth-asserting concepts, they have great appropriateness and viability. In this module on understanding modernity in India, we have understood or we have discussed about the important concepts of Sanskritization and Westernization. Though the use of Sanskritization and Westernization in the present modern day context of India seems limited, it is very important to historically locate the analysis of social change in India. Rather, today the whole idea of understanding change is understood within questioning the binary of tradition and modernity and also questioning the simplistic argument of Sanskritization and Westernization. But rather, if we want to understand the contested notion of modernity in India, but as a useful concept in understanding the nature of social change in India, as students of sociology, it is important to understand how one of the doyen of Indian sociologists, M. N. Srinivas, conceptualized social change in India.